If I may, I'd like to recommend a podcast that's rather unsettling. It's called Spooked. Now, this isn't fiction. Spooked features true accounts of the supernatural, told firsthand by the people who experience them. They are quiet, deeply personal stories of things that, frankly, shouldn't happen, but did. One episode in particular caught me, Disembodied Busybodies. It tells the story of a woman named Catherine who moved into a lovely old house, only to find she's not alone. Jimmy and Joyce, the previous occupants, are still very much present, despite having died. Catherine doesn't feel afraid so much as worn down by ghosts who still think it's their home. It's beautifully told with that creeping sense of unease that sneaks up on you. New episodes arrive each Friday, and you can find Spooked on all major podcast platforms. If you've ever wondered if there's more to this world than meets the eye, give it a listen, but perhaps not just before bed. Welcome to our paranormal afterlife. This is an episode of Paranormal Stories. Today I'll be talking about Helen Duncan, a Scottish physical medium. Known for producing ectoplasm during her séances, she gained attention when she revealed the sinking of HMS Barham before it was made public. This led to her arrest and trial in the British courts. Helen Duncan's name resounds in British spiritualist history with a mixture of awe, controversy and sorrow. Born into modest circumstances in Scotland, she became a woman whose life was marked by the extraordinary. Voices from the other side, ghostly forms stepping out of the darkness, and the tender reunions between the living and the dead. She was no charlatan in the eyes of her followers, but a vessel of truth, a medium who carried messages from beyond the veil. In the 1940s, when the world was consumed by war, Duncan's séances offered something desperately needed: hope. Families who feared for sons, husbands and brothers overseas found solace in the pale faces of spirits she called forth, clothed in ectoplasmic robes. Her story is not simply that of a trial or a scandal, but of a woman who bridged the gap between worlds in a time of crisis, and who suffered for the gifts she bore. Helen McFarlane was born in 1897 in the small town of Callander, Perthshire. From a young age, she was known locally for unusual sensitivities. She would sometimes speak of seeing visions or hearing voices that others could not, and though such tendencies might have been dismissed as imagination in another child, for Helen they became the foundation of her life's calling. She married Henry Duncan, a man injured during the First World War, and the couple settled into a working-class life. They raised 6 children, and Helen, like so many women of her time, shouldered the burdens of both motherhood and income generation. By day, she took on factory jobs. By night, she gathered people in dimly lit rooms and opened herself to the world of the spirits. By the 1920s, spiritualism was a familiar presence in British society. The First World War had shattered families, and countless mourners longed for contact with their dead. For them, mediums were not tricksters but healers, bridging the unbearable chasm of loss. Helen Duncan's natural ability to enter trance and to let spiritual energies flow through her made her one of the most remarkable of these healers. Helen's séances were unlike those of any other mediums. Where some simply conveyed words from beyond, she produced astonishing physical manifestations. From her body, in states of deep trance, came a substance known as ectoplasm. It was white, gauzy, and otherworldly, sometimes thin and rope-like, but other times forming broad sheets. In the darkness of the séance room, it seemed to live and move of its own accord. Witnesses described how the ectoplasm would stretch across the floor, shimmer in the candlelight, and slowly take form. Out of its folds, faces emerged, pale but recognizable, belonging to departed relatives or friends. On occasion, whole figures stepped forth, robed in the mysterious substance, and embraced their loved ones. These moments were unforgettable. In a time when death was an almost daily visitor to British homes, the possibility of reunion, even briefly, was a balm for the soul. The word ectoplasm had been introduced decades earlier by psychical researchers, but Helen Duncan embodied its reality. Her sitters did not see mere cloth or illusion. They saw their dead made visible, palpable, and real. They wept, they prayed, and they returned again and again to her séances because they knew in their hearts that the spirits were truly present. The 1930s had already made Helen Duncan known within the spiritualist circles, but it was during the Second World War that her reputation spread widely. With men away at sea, with cities bombed, and with casualty telegrams striking households daily, there was an immense hunger for comfort. Mediums across Britain found themselves in demand, and Helen was among the most sought after. She travelled to naval towns like Portsmouth, where wives and mothers longed for news of their sailors. In darkened rooms, she sat, her body trembling as the power gathered, and soon the voices of sailors and soldiers came through. The apparitions were so vivid that even hardened men who attended out of curiosity left convinced that they had seen spirits. Helen's séances were not entertainment, they were sacred rituals. Hymns were sung, prayers offered, and silence fell as the air thickened with expectancy. When the ectoplasm appeared, it was received with reverence. Here, in the midst of a war that scattered families and silenced so many young lives, the dead spoke again. The episode that brought Helen Duncan into collision with the authorities occurred in late 1941. On the 25th of November, the battleship HMS Barham was torpedoed in the Mediterranean. Within minutes, she rolled over and exploded. The Admiralty, fearful of damaging morale and of giving useful intelligence to the enemy, chose to withhold the news from the public for weeks. Families of the dead were informed privately. The German radio claimed the sinking, but official Britain remained silent until 27th of January 1942. In this tense silence, Helen Duncan held a séance in Portsmouth. As the room darkened, ectoplasm flowed from her mouth and formed in the figure of a sailor. On his cap, clearly visible to the astonished sitters, were the letters HMS Barham. Through her, he spoke of the disaster. The revelation shocked all present. The Admiralty had not yet confirmed the loss, yet here was a spirit sailor declaring it plainly. For the families who heard this, it was both devastating and consoling. Devastating to know that loved ones had been lost, but consoling to receive proof that the dead were not extinguished, that they remained conscious in another realm. Word spread quickly. To believers, it was irrefutable evidence of Duncan's gift. To the authorities, it was deeply troubling. How could she know of the sinking before it was public? Did she have access to naval secrets? Or was she truly speaking with the spirits of the dead? As the war dragged on, Duncan's activities drew increasing scrutiny. Security officers began to fear that her séances might inadvertently reveal other sensitive information. Families who attended often included people connected with the services, and if spirits spoke through Helen of operations or disasters before the government announced them, the results could be chaotic. In 1943 and 1944, undercover officers began attending her séances. Some were convinced she was genuine. Others reported skepticism. But for the authorities, it hardly mattered whether her powers were supernatural or not. The fact was that she was speaking truths that were meant to be secret. On the night of 19th January 1944, police raided a séance Helen was conducting in Portsmouth. The room was dark, hymns were being sung, and the first ectoplasmic form had emerged. Suddenly the lights blazed and officers rushed forward. In the chaos, Helen herself was seized, struggling as ectoplasm clung to her. The sacred atmosphere was shattered. She was arrested along with several associates. At first, the charge was a minor one under the Vagrancy Act. but the case escalated quickly. Because of her earlier mention of HMS Barham, and because of her fame as a medium, the authorities sought a heavier indictment. In an extraordinary move, they dusted off the Witchcraft Act of 1735, a law nearly 2 centuries old. Helen Duncan's trial began on 23rd of March 1944 at the Old Bailey. It was a spectacle. Newspapers played up the irony of witchcraft trial in modern times, calling her the last witch of Britain. Spiritualists across the country rallied to her defence, arguing that the trial was an attack on their religion. For 7 days the court heard testimony. Sisters described the comfort they had received from Helen's séances, how the ectoplasmic forms of their husbands and sons had returned to embrace them, how voices from beyond had given them hope. They insisted that what they had witnessed was real. The prosecution, however, pressed the charge that Helen had pretended to conjure up spirits and thus was guilty under the Witchcraft Act. They claimed that she was deceiving the public. The case was more than legal, it was symbolic. For her supporters, Helen stood as proof that spirit communication was real and that love endured beyond death. For the authorities, she was a dangerous figure whose powers, however explained, could compromise wartime secrecy. On the 3rd of April 1944, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty. Helen Duncan was sentenced to 9 months' imprisonment in Holloway Prison. She became the last person in Britain to be imprisoned under the Witchcraft Act. In Holloway, Helen's health suffered. She was a heavy-set woman already prone to ailments, and the strain of imprisonment weighed heavily upon her. But even there, she remained convinced of her calling. She prayed, she wrote, and she longed to return to her family. Upon her release later in 1944, she vowed to give up séances, but her devotion to the spirits could not be silenced. She continued, sometimes clandestinely, and her loyal followers never deserted her. To them, she was a martyr, a woman punished not for fraud, but for telling truths too dangerous for governments to bear. In 1956, during a séance in Edinburgh, she collapsed. The trance was broken, the room thrown into confusion, and Helen was carried out. She died soon afterwards at the age of 59. To her followers, it seemed that the strain of years of persecution, the raids, and the prison sentence had finally broken her body. Helen Duncan was more than a medium. She was a mother, a healer, and a voice for the countless dead who sought to reach their loved ones during years of horror. Her séances were sacred gatherings where absence became presence, where silence gave way to whispered names, and where grief was eased by the touch of a spirit hand. The state may have called her fraudulent, but to the thousands who found comfort in her presence, she was nothing less than genuine. She offered proof that love survives death, that no life is truly extinguished, and that in the darkness of war, light could still shine through the veil. Today I was talking about the physical medium Helen Duncan. And my book on verified near-death experiences is out now on Amazon, and you can get it on paperback, audiobook, or on Kindle. A great way to support the podcast is to sign up on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/Our Paranormal Afterlife, or click on the button on my homepage at pastliveshypnosis.co.uk. And if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review and be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or via your favourite podcast app to make sure that you don't miss out on any episodes. And thanks for listening.